The chamber air was already charged before Kamala Harris leaned forward, her voice sharp, slicing through the low hum of shuffling papers and murmured side conversations. The vice president's words didn't merely interrupt the proceedings. They detonated like a sudden crack of thunder in a sky that had been heavy all morning. This grandstanding has gone too far. Her tone was not the measured cadence Americans were used to, the careful prosecutor's precision she had honed for decades. No, this was raw, heated, carrying the brittle edge of frustration and the unmistakable undercurrent of fury. The sound reverberated against the paneled walls of the committee room, silencing aides mid-scribble, freezing the press corps with pens suspended in air. Across from her sat Jasmine Crockett, posture unbroken, hands calmly interlaced as though the eruption had been expected all along. She did not blink at the accusation. Her gaze remained steady, unshaken, a quiet steeliness radiating from the calm of her folded hands. The audience, lawmakers, interns, journalists, shifted in their seats, their attention locked on the sudden fissure cracking open in front of them. This was not a routine clash of rhetoric. It was something deeper, more personal, and infinitely more dangerous. The gavel had been resting lightly in Harris's hand until now, but her grip tightened, knuckles blanching as she tapped it once, not to restore order but to punctuate her anger. "We are here to legislate, not to perform." Her voice carried a sharpness meant to wound, a line designed not just for the chamber, but for the headlines she knew would spin before the day was done. Still, Crockett did not move. The silence she held was louder than Harris's words, a silence that commanded the room with unnerving composure. She leaned forward ever so slightly, as though absorbing the force of Harris's eruption rather than resisting it. The quiet became unbearable. A reporter in the gallery mouthed, "Wow," while another clicked frantically at a camera shutter. Every second stretched. Every breath seemed amplified. Crockett finally raised her eyes fully to Harris, her voice soft but steady, so calm that it cut deeper than any shouted rebuttal. "If speaking the truth sounds like theater, Madam Vice President, then what name do we give to silence?" The chamber stilled. A ripple passed through the seats, a soundless exhale from dozens of bodies that had not realized they'd been holding their breath. Harris's jaw tightened, her lips pressing into a thin line. She had fired the first shot, but Crockett's reply did not return fire. It froze the battlefield. Somewhere in the back, a journalist muttered under his breath, "This is history." The camera zoomed closer. The contrast was cinematic. Harris, fiery and explosive, battling for control of the room, versus Crockett, calm and unflinching, her poise sharpening every word she released. The bowstring of tension drew tighter, ready to snap. Everyone knew this was no ordinary hearing. It was not simply a debate about laws or procedures. It was about vision, power, and two women who represented diverging answers to the same American question. How do you fight for democracy when it is under siege? The chamber was not just watching a disagreement. They were witnessing a fracture, one that would not be easily mended. The outburst hung in the air like the echo of a struck bell, still resonating as the chamber tried to reset itself. Yet beneath the silence, everyone in the room knew the foundation of the hearing had already shifted. This was not an ordinary gathering. It had been scheduled as part of a high-stakes oversight hearing on voting rights legislation, a subject that had consumed the country in headlines, courtrooms, and street protests for years. But from the moment the vice president herself had stepped into the room to preside, the energy had been different, humming with anticipation. Her presence was not ceremonial. It was intentional, a signal that the administration saw this moment as pivotal. The long oak tables were stacked with documents and binders, their tabs sticking out like tiny flags of war. Behind them sat witnesses, constitutional lawyers, civil rights advocates, and state officials. The first rows of the gallery were packed with journalists and aides, their laptops glowing faintly under the heavy lighting. At the far end, a small group of activists clutched signs on their laps, not raised, not shouted, but quietly visible. "Protect our vote. Democracy can't wait." Kamala Harris adjusted her papers with sharp, deliberate movements, Every gesture carried weight. Every expression was measured. For her, this fight was not theoretical. She had been Attorney General of California, had seen firsthand the labyrinth of laws used to suppress participation, had argued against them in court. But she was also Vice President now, an office that lived under the pressure of compromise, where every word was dissected, every tone judged for balance. Across from her, Jasmine Crockett radiated a different kind of energy. Where Harris represented the institutional guardrails of power, Crockett embodied the insurgent urgency of grassroots politics. She had risen through the crucible of activism and law, carrying stories from communities that had been silenced for decades. She wasn't there to reassure the room with procedure. She was there to ignite it with truth. The first exchange of the morning had been dry, almost ceremonial. Witnesses reciting statistics, charts filled with percentages of voter turnout drops, lines stretching for hours in predominantly black districts. But tension bubbled beneath the surface, waiting for a single crack to unleash it. Crockett leaned forward during her questioning of a civil rights scholar, her tone precise, layered with lived urgency. When you see a state shorten voting hours in black neighborhoods but extend them in white suburbs, is that administrative efficiency or systemic targeting? The witness hesitated before answering, his voice careful. It's difficult to call it anything but discriminatory impact. Crockett's eyes flashed as she turned slightly toward the gallery, letting the words linger, for the record. Discriminatory impact is the legal term, but the lived term is suppression. And suppression, Madam Vice President, is the theft of a voice. Murmurs rose from the gallery. The line was sharp, poetic, delivered not just to the committee but to the country beyond the cameras. Harris's fingers tapped against her papers, a staccato rhythm that betrayed her growing impatience. This is not a courtroom spectacle, she cut in, her gavel striking once. Her tone tried for authority but landed with something closer to irritation. We are here to deliberate legislation, not to rehearse moral theater. The room shifted. Journalists scribbled frantically. Staffers exchanged quick, nervous glances. For a heartbeat, it seemed as though Harris's interjection might cow Crockett into retreat. But Crockett's face remained unflinching. Her voice was calm, each syllable deliberate. Madam Vice President, if urgency makes you uncomfortable, what will silence do to the people losing their rights? The words weren't shouted. They weren't even emphasized with volume. But they landed with the force of a hammer. Silence followed. The silence of a room collectively realizing it had just witnessed a line that would outlive the hearing itself. Harris's lips pressed into a thin line, her jaw tightening as if the room's weight had suddenly pressed back against her authority. She tapped the gavel again, softer this time, but the attempt at regaining control felt diminished. The cameras captured everything. The vice president's tension, the congresswoman's composure, the gallery leaning forward like spectators at the edge of a cliff. It was only the first chapter of the day, and yet the outlines of a historic confrontation were already clear. A battle not of enemies, but of visions. Harris, the institutional guardian of patience and compromise. Crockett, the insurgent voice of urgency and survival. What the nation saw was not simply disagreement. It was the shape of a fracture, one that threatened to widen as the day went on. And in that fracture, the stakes of democracy itself trembled. The gavel's echo had barely faded when the next wave of questioning began. The chamber was still tense from the earlier exchange, and yet everyone in the room sensed that the confrontation had not ended. It had only paused, suspended like a storm cloud hovering above. Jasmine Crockett leaned forward, her voice steady but sharpened with precision. "Professor Daniels," she said, addressing the civil rights scholar on the witness panel, "you've outlined the legal framework for discriminatory impact. But let's make this plain. These laws that close polling places in predominantly black neighborhoods, are they protecting democracy or are they suffocating it?" The professor adjusted his glasses nervously. "Congresswoman, I would argue they—" Crockett didn't let the hesitation linger. "Because what I see," she pressed, her tone unwavering, "is systemic targeting. Voters being told their district has one polling place for 50,000 people, while suburban districts have 10. Voters turned away because their signature doesn't match a file from 20 years ago. That isn't democracy. That's theft dressed up as procedure. The words landed hard. Activists in the gallery shifted in their seats, some nodding silently, others clutching their signs a little tighter. The cameras captured everything. Crockett's measured delivery, the professor's uneasy silence, the murmurs building in the back rows, and then Harris's voice cut across the room, sharp as glass. Congresswoman, this hearing is about legislation, not slogans. We are not here to dramatize, we are here to deliberate. The words stung with the force of an elder chastising a junior, but the room understood there was more at play. Harris's interjection wasn't only about procedure, it was about control. Control of the narrative, control of the tempo, control of how the fight for democracy was framed. Crockett turned her gaze toward Harris, not with defiance but with a deliberate calm. With respect, Madam Vice President, when people are being silenced, clarity is not dramatization, it is duty. The room froze again, the silence swelling as though every heartbeat was suddenly amplified. A young journalist in the gallery scribbled furiously. Crockett challenges Harris. Tension explodes. Harris's fingers tapped against her papers again, that restless rhythm betraying her irritation. She leaned forward, her voice lower this time, but no less charged. Clarity without strategy delivers nothing. If we want to pass legislation, we need to build coalitions, not theater. Crockett's reply was softer still, her tone almost disarming in contrast. And coalitions mean little to those who have already been erased from the rolls. They can't wait for perfection. They need protection. The words weren't a shout. They weren't even a direct confrontation, but they struck at the heart of Harris's point, turning the argument inside out. The vice president's eyes narrowed, her lips tightening, as though she were weighing whether to strike back harder or let the moment pass. Around them, the committee room seemed to breathe in unison, caught in the push and pull of two philosophies colliding. Witnesses sat frozen, unsure whether to intervene. Staffers lowered their eyes, pretending to organize papers while secretly listening with rapt attention. The gallery leaned forward, the weight of the confrontation drawing them closer like moths to flame. For Crockett, every word she spoke came, tethered to lived reality. Elders waiting in line for hours, young voters turned away for minor discrepancies, families silenced by bureaucratic cruelty. For Harris, every word she spoke carried the burden of strategy, the Senate's unforgiving math, the thin ice of bipartisan negotiation, the scars of deals made and broken. Neither woman was wrong, but neither could yield without betraying something core to their identity. The press gallery began buzzing. Reporters whispered to each other, their eyes darting from Harris to Crockett and back. They knew the story unfolding was no longer about the technicalities of voting rights bills. It was about two powerful black women embodying divergent strategies within the same cause, and the friction that resulted when urgency collided with pragmatism. A CNN correspondent leaned over to her colleague, muttering, "This is going viral. Clips of this will be on every feed before lunch." And she was right. The cameras had already caught the flashpoint. Harris, visibly irritated, voice sharp and unguarded. Crockett, calm and precise, her words resonating beyond the room. The clash wasn't just about voting rights anymore. It was about tone, about urgency, about the philosophical weight of how one fights for justice. Crockett's poise transformed her into the insurgent voice of immediacy, while Harris's eruption painted her as the embattled guardian of the system itself. The sparks had flown, and the storm had only just begun. The clock ticked past noon, its steady rhythm barely audible above the shuffling of papers and the murmured exchanges between staffers. But beneath the surface of routine, the atmosphere was anything but ordinary. The chamber was tight with expectation, the kind that pressed against skin and made every sound sharper, every glance more telling. Crockett was back at the microphone, her questioning now turning away from abstract legalities and toward lived stories. She spoke of voters in Dallas County who had stood in line so long that one woman fainted and was carried away before she ever cast a ballot. She told of veterans denied because a clerk said their signatures didn't match. Each story was surgical, delivered without theatrics, yet cutting in its precision. Democracy, Crockett said, her voice steady, cannot call itself whole while it erases the very people it claims to serve. The words hung in the room. They weren't shouted, they didn't need to be, but to Harris they felt like daggers. Not because she disagreed with their truth, but because each account reminded her of the impossible balance she carried. The duty to fight injustice while navigating an unforgiving Senate that demanded compromise. Crockett's words did not account for the long nights Harris had spent whipping votes, the countless calls to moderate lawmakers who balked at anything too bold. To Harris, Crockett's sharp truths risked undermining the fragile coalition she was trying to protect. Her patience thinned. She shifted forward in her chair, her knuckles brushing the stack of notes she hadn't touched in minutes. The gavel in her hand became less a tool of order and more a weapon of emphasis. Her eyes narrowed as she watched Crockett lean into another story, this time of a young man turned away for a misplaced ID card. "This chamber is not a courtroom," Harris snapped suddenly, her voice cutting through Crockett's words. "It is not a stage for catalogs of pain." Gasps rippled across the room. The interruption was sharp, unguarded, almost reckless. It was the kind of eruption rarely seen from Harris, whose public image was often built on careful discipline. But the vice president's tone carried years of accumulated frustration. The endless battles for incremental progress, the compromises that tasted like ash, the sense that urgency without pragmatism was fire without fuel. Crockett stopped, mid-sentence. She did not recoil. Her body remained still, but her eyes sharpened, focusing on Harris with an unflinching steadiness. The silence in her pause spoke louder than Harris's outburst. The reporters felt it immediately. Pens scratched furiously. Cameras zoomed closer. This was the kind of unscripted moment they lived for, where polished rhetoric gave way to raw emotion, where power itself seemed to teeter. Harris slammed the gavel once against the desk, not out of necessity but out of sheer force. "We cannot reduce this chamber to performance," she declared, her voice rising, "when the future of legislation depends on strategy, not spectacle." The words echoed against the paneled walls, bouncing through the chamber like a shout in a canyon. Her face, usually so measured, now flushed with heat. Her hands trembled faintly, not with weakness, but with the intensity of her anger. For a long moment, Crockett said nothing. She simply held Harris's gaze, letting the room absorb the rawness of the vice president's fury. Her silence was unnerving, a mirror that reflected Harris's loss of control. Finally, Crockett spoke, her tone quiet but sharp enough to slice through the tension. "Madam Vice President, if you hear these stories as performance, perhaps you've forgotten they are not lines, they are lives." The chamber froze. It was not just a reply, it was a reversal, turning Harris's accusation back on itself. Crockett hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't slammed a desk. Yet the weight of her calm precision made Harris's eruption look unmoored, almost desperate. The audience shifted, again. A young aide in the back whispered to a colleague. She flipped it on her, without even raising her voice. Harris's jaw tightened. Her eyes darted briefly to the gallery, as though realizing in real time how her anger would play, on camera, how it would be clipped and replayed across the nation before the day was done. She inhaled slowly, trying to steady herself, but the damage was done. Crockett leaned back in her chair, her hands folding again, her body language radiating composure. It was as if she had decided that silence itself was her strongest weapon. The chamber felt suspended, a room caught between fury and poise, strategy and urgency. Harris had boiled over. Crockett had stayed cold. And in the contrast, the narrative wrote itself. The storm was no longer coming. It had arrived. The hearing chamber had shifted into something less like a political forum and more like an arena. The clash between Kamala Harris and Jasmine Crockett was no longer a surprise. It was the spectacle. Journalists leaned over the brass rails of the press box, whispering into recorders, sending hurried notes to editors. The story was already traveling beyond the walls of the Capitol, threaded into headlines waiting to ignite. Kamala's voice carried the authority of office, but also the strain of someone who felt her control slipping. "You have mistaken defiance for principle," she said, her hand pressed flat against the polished mahogany desk. Her gaze cut across the room, not just at Crockett, but at the entire chamber. "This is not about your grandstanding. This is about respect. For this institution, for this country." The words landed like stones dropped into still water, but the ripples didn't last. Jasmine remained seated, her expression unreadable but her silence heavy, deliberate. That refusal to rush into defense was a blade of its own. The longer she waited, the more the vice president's composure seemed to fray. A murmur traveled through the chamber. Reporters scratched pens to paper. One aide whispered, "She's baiting her. Crockett's waiting her out." Another leaned in, nodding. "And it's working." Finally, Jasmine drew a breath and straightened her back, her voice calm yet edged with steel. "Madam Vice President," she began, her words deliberate, measured. "Respect is not silence in the face of abuse. Respect is not compliance when truth demands resistance." She paused, letting the words resonate. "You speak of institutions. I speak of the people these institutions serve." The gallery erupted in a wave of reaction, gasps, murmurs, the rustle of cameras zooming closer. Even those who opposed her had to admit Crockett's command of the moment was undeniable. Kamala's jaw tightened. She leaned closer, voice pitched low as though speaking across a chasm. "Do you believe you alone carry the truth?" "No," Jasmine replied, her tone unwavering. "But I refuse to be shamed for carrying my piece of it, and I will not sit quietly while even our allies treat justice like a performance." The word performance cut like a lash. It was not only a retort, it was an accusation that the vice president's outburst had been less about principle and more about spectacle. Harris recoiled slightly, as though the blow had struck deeper than expected. The audience caught the shift. Phones buzzed in the laps of aides. One reporter mouthed to another, "That's the headline." But Jasmine wasn't finished. She leaned forward now, hands unclasping, her body language transitioning from patience to purpose. "You say I confuse defiance with principle. I say you confuse unity with silence. And if unity demands that I mute my conscience, then that is not unity, it is control." Her words were calm, but their impact was seismic. Even Harris's supporters hesitated before reacting. The vice president's lips parted, ready with a rebuttal, but the sound caught in her throat. For a heartbeat, there was only silence. The kind of silence that felt louder than any outcry. The press gallery leaned in as one, the chamber on the edge of eruption. It was the moderator's gavel that shattered the moment, a sharp crack of wood against wood. "Order in the chamber." The voice carried authority, but its echo did little to contain the charged energy flooding the room. Still, Jasmine's last words lingered. They clung to the air like smoke, impossible to wave away. Harris sat back, exhaling slowly, attempting to gather what remained of her poise. But the damage was done. What began as an attack had turned into a defense she hadn't prepared for, a duel of restraint against raw authority. The crowd knew it too. Their eyes followed Crockett now, not Harris. The tide of attention had shifted. Somewhere in the press, a journalist whispered the thought on everyone's mind. That wasn't just defiance, that was history. The committee room had grown into something beyond its intended design. It was no longer a space for deliberation or oversight. It had transformed into a crucible where ideology, emotion, and raw ambition collided in full view of the nation. The cameras drank in every detail, the sweat glistening on brows, the quiet, tightening of lips, the restless shuffle of papers that seemed louder than thunder in the silence that followed each exchange. What had begun as a hearing was now a battle for credibility itself. Kamala Harris, once the poised prosecutor who thrived in the quiet tension of a courtroom, now found herself straddling two competing realities. On one side, the legacy of her vice presidency, defined by scrutiny, shaped by expectations, and strained under constant criticism. On the other, the fiery presence of Jasmine Crockett, who had carved out her reputation not in marble chambers or law school debates, but in the unforgiving glare of real-world injustice. Harris's voice cracked, not with weakness, but with the strain of a leader cornered by her own authority. "You think your passion shields you from responsibility?" Harris's words cut sharply, a blade disguised as a question. Her cadence, perfected through years of debate and courtroom cross-examinations, rang like an indictment. "Representative Crockett, this is not a theater. This is governance. Your dramatics may play for the cameras, but governance is not performance." Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. Instead, she leaned back slightly, letting Harris's words fill the room before answering with measured clarity. "Performance? Senator, Madam Vice President, what you're calling performance is what my constituents call survival. It's what families call demanding accountability when no one listens. If raising my voice is performance, then silence must be complicity, and I refuse to be complicit." A hush spread. Crockett's reply wasn't shouted, nor was it rapped, in rhetorical flourish. It was delivered with the kind of authenticity that didn't need polish. Her words didn't seek applause, they demanded reckoning. The cameras lingered on her face, the subtle steel in her eyes, the hint of exhaustion beneath them. The visual itself spoke volumes. This wasn't theater. It was the embodiment of lived struggle in dialogue with institutional power. Kamala's jaw tightened. She was used to sparring with senators, prosecutors, lobbyists, people who knew the rules of the performance and obeyed its boundaries. But Crockett's refusal to play by those boundaries was her strength. It disrupted Kamala's rhythm, destabilized the argument, and threatened to turn the hearing into something Harris couldn't control. Reporters sensed the shift. Tweets began to fly, framing the clash as generational, racial, ideological. Words like historic and explosive were already trending. Yet in the room, what mattered wasn't the online noise. It was the sharp inhale of every person who realized they were witnessing a genuine clash of visions. Harris pressed forward, though, her prosecutorial instincts driving her past hesitation. "You're conflating passion with principle, Congresswoman. Accountability doesn't come from outbursts, it comes from discipline, from deliberation, from law." Crockett's reply landed like a slow, deliberate hammer. Law has never been neutral. Deliberation has never been free of power, and discipline without truth, that's just obedience. The words hit like a sudden chill. Some in the chamber shifted uncomfortably, others nodded subtly, unable to deny the weight of her observation. It wasn't just a rebuttal, it was a reframing of the entire hearing. By refusing to fight on Kamala's terms, Crockett had pulled the ground out from beneath her opponent. And yet, what made the moment electrifying wasn't triumph or defeat, it was the suspended tension. Two women bound by the same system stood locked in conflict over what that system meant. The cameras, the audience, the committee. They weren't just watching a clash of personalities. They were witnessing a question being asked of the nation itself. What does accountability look like when the rules themselves are contested? The silence that followed was heavier than words. It was the silence of a room that understood history was not being spoken. It was being argued into existence. The hearing chamber by now had grown into a pressure cooker. Every cough, every shuffle of paper, every restless click of a pen seemed amplified against the marble walls. By the time Kamala Harris leaned forward again, her tone had sharpened. No longer measured. Her voice had a serrated edge. "Congresswoman Crockett," she said, stressing the title almost mockingly. "We are not here to hear lectures. We are here to establish clarity on matters the American people deserve answers to. Instead of deflecting, can you address the specific failures, your failures, to support legislation that strengthens national security while you grandstand on civil rights posturing?" The words cut through the air like broken glass. Some in the gallery gasped. Others leaned in, hungry for conflict. The subtext was obvious. Harris was not only questioning policy positions, she was questioning Crockett's integrity, her seriousness, her very right to be at the table. For a long beat, Jasmine said nothing. She let the silence breathe, let Harris's words sit heavy in the chamber. Her hands rested calmly on the table, her gaze steady, not once flinching under the vice president's glare. Then, finally, Jasmine spoke, her voice low but unmistakably resolute. "Madam Vice President," she began, the formality deliberate, "you suggest that civil rights are a distraction, but for the communities I represent, civil rights are national security. When black mothers fear their sons will not come home at night because of systemic injustice, that is a national security issue. When voters are silenced through restrictive laws, democracy itself is at risk. And when corporations profit from division while Congress looks away, our country is weakened from within." The room froze. Her words weren't loud, but they landed, with a force Harris's volume could never match. Kamala leaned back slightly, her lips pressed into a tight line. She hadn't expected Crockett to reframe the argument so sharply. Crockett wasn't on the defensive. She had pivoted, transforming Harris's accusation into a moral declaration. Across the dais, a few other lawmakers shifted uncomfortably. What Crockett had just done was strip the veneer off the debate, reducing it to a question of values rather than policy jargon. The chamber now carried the electric sense of a turning point. But Harris was not finished. She tapped her pen against her folder, the rhythmic sound echoing like a gavel. "Fine words," she snapped, "but rhetoric does not protect borders. Rhetoric does not dismantle cartels. And rhetoric does not keep America safe from adversaries who are watching these very hearings and laughing at our dysfunction. So tell me, Congresswoman, how do your so-called civil rights crusades answer to the mother in El Paso who lost her son to fentanyl, or the father in Baltimore who buries his child because the system you claim to defend failed him?" It was a devastating move, invoking the faces of grieving families, weaponizing their tragedies against Crockett's convictions. The chamber's collective breath caught, knowing Crockett would need more than passion to respond. Jasmine inhaled, slowly, grounding herself. When she spoke, her tone carried no anger, only a haunting steadiness. "I answer them, Madam Vice President, by refusing to separate their pain from the larger truth. That fentanyl crisis? It thrives because of profit-driven negligence and lack of accountability, not because of civil rights. That father in Baltimore? His child's death was not inevitable. It was a failure of investment, a failure of will, a failure of leaders who speak of safety, yet vote against funding schools and health care. If you want to talk about national security, let us talk about securing justice at home. Because without it, there is no homeland strong enough to withstand enemies abroad." The words echoed, and for the first time in the hearing, even Harris had no immediate retort. Her silence wasn't surrender, it was calculation, but to the audience it felt like Crockett had seized control. The room was utterly still, every camera capturing the moment where calm defiance outshone political fury. The chamber was heavy with silence, the kind that seemed to vibrate against the walls and seep into the bones of everyone present. The tension from the earlier exchange still lingered like smoke after a fire, and yet the hearing pressed on. Every camera remained fixed, every reporter's pen hovered in anticipation, and every eye darted between Kamala Harris and Jasmine Crockett as if waiting for one of them to ignite again. It was in this fragile quiet that the committee chair cleared his throat. "Representative Crockett," he said evenly, "you may respond." Jasmine rose with the kind of measured grace that only deep conviction can steady. Her hands rested lightly on the edge of the table as she leaned forward, her eyes finding Kamala Harris across the chamber. There was no venom in her gaze, no trace of anger, only a deliberate calm that carried a heavier weight than fury ever could. "Madam Vice President," Jasmine began, her tone quiet but cutting. "You speak of urgency, of unity, of stakes that cannot be ignored. But unity cannot be demanded while injustice is tolerated, and urgency cannot be invoked when it conveniently silences accountability. The words landed with surgical precision. One of the senators shifted uncomfortably in his chair. A camera zoomed in on Harris, whose jaw tightened, though she forced herself to hold composure. "You call my response performative," Jasmine continued, her voice steady. "But performance is what happens when appearances matter more than truth. What I am doing here is not performance, it is testimony. Testimony to the communities whose voices have been drowned out for generations, whose pain has been repackaged as a statistic, whose faith in this democracy has been tested again and again." Her words rose not in volume, but in gravity. The audience leaned forward, caught in the magnetism of her delivery. Even those who disagreed could not look away. Kamala shifted, interrupting sharply. "Representative, no one in this chamber is denying the existence of inequity. What I question is whether your tactics, your insistence on confrontation, bring us closer to solutions, or simply fracture our cause further." There it was again, the clash not of enemies but of allies divided by philosophy. The room held its breath. Jasmine's reply was swift but not sharp, as though she had been preparing for this moment all along. "Confrontation," she said softly, "is not the enemy of progress. Silence is. History did not move forward because people waited patiently for their oppressors to hand them justice. It moved because voices rose where silence once reigned." Her eyes flickered across the chamber, catching the gaze of a young aide in the back row, who appeared visibly shaken by her words. The civil rights movement was called disruptive. The suffragettes were called divisive. Dr. King was called extreme. But without disruption, power has no reason to change. Without confrontation, injustice has no mirror to see itself in. The courtroom-like space seemed to pulse with her words. Kamala leaned back slightly, her face unreadable, though the tension in her posture betrayed the weight of Jasmine's argument. The chair attempted to interject, but Jasmine pressed forward, her tone never breaking from its calm rhythm. "I don't raise my voice because I am angry at you, Madam Vice President. I raise it because those I represent have been silenced too long, and if my voice shakes the room, then so be it. It is only because their pain deserves to be heard, at full volume." The silence that followed was not empty. It was charged, reverent even, as though the room itself recognized the truth of what had just been said. A few murmurs broke through the crowd, quiet, almost involuntary gasps that betrayed the collective realization that this was not just a political clash, but a moral reckoning unfolding in real time. Kamala Harris sat perfectly still, her face a careful mask. But in her stillness there was also a recognition, an unspoken acknowledgement that Jasmine Crockett had seized the moment, not with aggression, but with a calm so powerful it froze the room itself. The chamber had grown quieter, with every exchange, but by the time Crockett adjusted the microphone and leaned forward, it was not silence. It was suspense. The cameras panned across the dais, capturing the look of a vice president who had just lost control of her rhythm, and a congresswoman who refused to flinch under the weight of office. "Madam Vice President," Crockett began, her voice steady, each word deliberate. "Anger is not governance. Raising your voice does not strengthen your argument. The American people, our people, didn't send us here for a shouting match. They sent us here for clarity, for courage, and for truth." The words hung in the air like a gavel strike. Harris shifted in her seat, gripping her pen as though it were the last anchor against the tide of Crockett's tone. Around the chamber, aides whispered, reporters scribbled furiously, and the audience sensed they were witnessing more than a disagreement. They were witnessing a test of authority itself. Harris tried to regain her footing. "Congresswoman Crockett," she said, this time in a softer but sharper tone, "don't lecture me on courage. I've stood in courtrooms where women had no defenders, where children were left without voices. I've fought battles you can't even imagine." Crockett did not blink. "And yet here we are. You speak of battles fought, but what of the battles still being ignored? Communities silenced, justice delayed, voices crushed under bureaucracy. If you, Madam Vice President, raise your voice at me rather than address them, what message does that send to the very people you claim to defend? The room froze. It wasn't defiance alone. It was precision. Crockett had shifted the confrontation from a personal clash into a moral indictment. The crowd of journalists leaned in. One could hear the whirring of camera shutters punctuating the silence. For a long second, Harris said nothing. Her eyes narrowed, her jaw tightened, but no words came. And it was in that silence that Crockett's composure won the ground. She hadn't raised her volume, hadn't resorted to theatrics. She had instead frozen the moment, forcing Harris to bear the weight of a quiet she could not fill. Narration deepened the stakes. Crockett was not just defending herself, she was embodying a different vision of power, one that refused to bow to intimidation, yet also refused to mirror it. This was where the moral theater of politics revealed its dual edge. For Harris, an eruption that slipped from passion to weakness. For Crockett, a calm that transformed restraint into strength. Behind the dais, a few lawmakers exchanged glances, some in admiration, others in alarm. They understood what had just happened. A viral moment was being born, not through shouting but through silence, not through force, but through poise. Then came the inevitable ripple. The chamber audience shifted from stunned stillness to hushed murmurs. Phones lit up in the gallery. Tweets began to fly. Crockett freezes Harris live. Calm meets chaos. The moment the room stopped breathing, Harris cleared her throat, finally breaking the silence. Perhaps, she said carefully as if weighing each syllable, we should remember that unity requires more than composure. It requires substance. Crockett leaned back, her expression unchanged. Then let's bring substance forward. But let's not confuse volume with vision. The room erupted not in chaos but in controlled electricity. Gasps, notes, the rapid-fire clicks of press cameras. Crockett's reply wasn't just a line. It was a strike against the unspoken rules of hierarchy, against the idea that office outweighs authenticity. And as the gavel struck to restore order, the realization set in. This confrontation was not over. It was only deepening. The chamber was no longer simply a courtroom. It had become a crucible. Every voice, every murmur of dissent or approval seemed magnified against the vaulted ceilings. Cameras clicked in feverish bursts, catching the sharp lines of tension etched across each face. At the center of it all stood Jasmine Crockett, no longer merely a freshman congresswoman, but a woman carrying the heavy burden of moral clarity in a room designed to fracture it. Kamala Harris leaned forward, her eyes sharp, her tone steeled with prosecutorial precision. Congresswoman Crockett, she said, her voice measured but cutting. Your defiance may play well for the cameras, but what exactly do you think it achieves here today? This is about governing, not grandstanding. The American people deserve more than your courtroom theatrics. A hush fell, the kind that only arises when a knife has been drawn, not in steel but in words. Jasmine, however, did not flinch. She folded her hands atop the table before her, waiting a beat longer than comfort allowed. When she finally spoke, her voice carried with it the weight of every suppressed voice she had promised to represent. Madam Vice President, she began, her tone deliberate. When truth is buried under politeness, justice dies in silence. If insisting on accountability is what you call theatrics, then I accept the role, because the alternative, the quiet complicity of powerful people, is far more dangerous to the American people. The words reverberated like a bell toll, and the room shifted again. Reporters scribbled with renewed frenzy. Members of the committee shifted in their seats, some exchanging uneasy glances. Harris pursed her lips, holding the silence just long enough to reassert dominance. Then she struck back. You mistake passion for governance, Harris replied coldly. I've been in this chamber. I've fought these fights longer than you've been in public office. What you call accountability can sometimes be a reckless refusal to understand the complexities of leadership. It's easy to play the hero when you're not the one carrying the burden of decision-making at the highest level. Jasmine leaned forward now, her calm steady as if the weight of Harris's words rolled off her shoulders like rain. And yet, history is full of leaders who hid behind complexity as an excuse for inaction. Tell me, Madam Vice President, how many times must the people wait while leaders explain to them how complicated justice is? How long must the vulnerable endure while the powerful debate timing? The sharpness of the exchange pierced through the room. Harris's jaw tightened. She had walked into this confrontation with every advantage: rank, experience, authority. Yet Crockett's words carried something less tangible but more potent: moral urgency. The committee chair attempted to intervene, tapping his gavel in hopes of cooling the storm. "Order, order," he muttered, though his own eyes betrayed the fascination he shared with everyone else in the chamber. But order had no place here anymore. The confrontation had become something larger than procedure. It was a mirror held up to the nation's politics. The vice president embodying the seasoned power of Washington against the rising congresswoman, unbent and unwilling to bow. "Congresswoman Crockett," Harris said again, lowering her voice, as if to remind Jasmine and everyone else that her words were not just political, they were personal. "You believe your calm defiance is strength, but strength also means knowing when to compromise, knowing when to hold fire, knowing that shouting into the void doesn't build anything, it only destroys." Jasmine's eyes did not leave hers. "I was elected to serve the people, not to negotiate away their dignity for the comfort of power. If compromise means silence, then I will not carry that shame. My calm, Madam Vice President, comes from knowing that the truth needs no theatrics, no compromise. It stands on its own." A silence descended that was heavier than any noise. Even the reporters, usually immune to the weight of words after years of covering Washington storms, seemed to pause their pens mid-scribble. It was then that something extraordinary happened. One of the spectators in the back, a civil rights activist her presence little noted until now, rose slowly to her feet. She did not shout, did not clap, did not break decorum. She simply stood, her presence a quiet echo of solidarity. And then another rose, and another. Soon half the chamber's audience was standing, their silence amplifying the moral clarity Jasmine had just delivered. Harris glanced back, her composure tightening into something unreadable. She had not expected to lose the room. Not like this, not to someone she once viewed as an ally but now faced as an opponent. Jasmine Crockett, however, did not rise or gesture in triumph. She remained seated, calm, her eyes steady, as though she understood the gravity of what had just occurred. It wasn't victory, it was accountability incarnate, a shift in the balance of perception that would ripple far beyond the chamber. The moment had crystallized. Kamala Harris's authority, sharpened by years in power, clashing with Crockett's unshakable calm. One fueled by the weight of office, the other by the clarity of conscience. And in that chamber, for that moment, it was clear which one the room believed. The committee chamber was no longer just a hearing room. By now it felt like a crucible, a stage where reputations could be forged or shattered under the relentless weight of public scrutiny. The air was heavy, not only with political tension, but with something more profound. The recognition that history was being shaped in real time. Cameras focused, pens hovered, and every eye in the nation seemed fixed on the unfolding duel between Vice President Kamala Harris and Representative Jasmine Crockett. The Vice President leaned forward again, her voice sharp, a mix of prosecutorial precision and political urgency. "Congresswoman, you claim to stand for transparency, yet your methods, your framing of issues, your selective outrage betray something else. What this chamber deserves is not posturing. It deserves solutions." Harris's words landed like blows, her cadence accelerating. Each syllable carried the rhythm of a seasoned litigator pressing a witness into a corner. Her gaze was steady, unblinking, meant to unnerve. Around her, the committee members shifted in their seats, some nodding in agreement, others stiffening at the spectacle of two powerful women colliding with such force. Crockett inhaled slowly. She did not match the vice president's volume or speed. Instead, she lowered her tone, a deliberate contrast that commanded the room. Madam Vice President, with all due respect, I will never apologize for being outraged when Americans are betrayed. I will never apologize for raising my voice when families are silenced by policies that fail them. Outrage is not posturing, it is conscience. The pause that followed was electric. Crockett's words seemed to slow time, drawing every ear closer. She did not gesture wildly, did not attempt to overpower. Her calmness was itself a challenge, a mirror held up to Harris's storm. Then she leaned forward, her own cadence precise, surgical. But here is what must be said plainly. Solutions without accountability are illusions. You and I can debate tone all day, but the truth is that people outside this chamber, people watching tonight, want both. They want someone who will not just soothe them with promises, but stand up and fight for justice even when it is uncomfortable. A ripple of murmurs swept the chamber. Crockett's reply had not been defensive. It had been disarmingly direct. Her calm words carried the weight of authenticity. Harris pursed her lips as if recalibrating. So you admit this is about performance then? That outrage is your chosen tool? Crockett's response was immediate, her voice steady but resonant. Performance? No, Madam Vice President. This is about witness. Bearing witness to suffering. Bearing witness to betrayal. Outrage is not a costume. It is the human response to injustice. To suppress it would be to betray the very people we serve.